Terkeurst, thank you so much for joining us on Undistracted. I really appreciate you coming and joining us.
Thank you. It's an honor to be with you.
Your new book, Good Boundaries and Goodbyes, how did you come about writing this one? Because, I mean, again, it's another really personal one for you to bring to us.
Well, probably because I knew I was going to spend 2 years studying this and being held accountable to living this, and I needed to study boundaries. I needed to get better at boundaries. So I don't write from my point of strength and like I get it all right. In this book, especially, I wrote from my point of struggle and determined to gain the biblical confidence and the emotional fortitude to be able to draw healthy boundaries.
And being able to create healthy boundaries is something I think a lot of us really struggle with, particularly in the area of relationships. It's hard to sum up, I suppose, a lifetime of trying to do this in one conversation. But how have you really worked out what a healthy boundary looks like and putting that into place?
So imagine these two words sitting in front of you, access and responsibility. So to the level that we give someone access to us, and that can be access financially, physically, emotionally, relationally, to the level that we give someone access to us, they need to bring that same level of responsibility so that they are responsible with the access that we're giving them. The problem comes and unhealthy dynamics and dysfunction happens when we give level 10 access, but this person is only bringing level 3 responsibility. The distance between those is relational turmoil and indication that a boundary is needed. So you can ask that person to be more responsible with the access, but if they're unwilling or incapable of anything above a level 3, the mistake that I've made is trying to put a boundary on that person to force them to be more responsible. The problem is we can't force another person to change if they don't themselves want to change. An unhealthy boundary is trying to punish that person, manipulate that person, or control that person. A much healthier way is to say, if they're unwilling or incapable of anything above a level 3 responsibility, I need to put a boundary on myself so that I can stay self-controlled, sane, and secure. So therefore, the boundary I put on myself is to reduce the access I grant down to the level of responsibility they demonstrate.
So how do you work out then if somebody is not responsible enough to be part of your inner circle?
It's a great question. Well, I'm going to flip the interview for a second and ask you a question, and we'll get to this answer through the questions I ask. Is that okay?
Sure, let's do it.
Okay. Do you have a bank account?
Yes.
Okay. Do you have a security passcode for that bank account?
Absolutely.
And is part of the reason why because you have limited funds in your bank account?
Sure. I don't want anyone getting in there.
Yeah. And so do you put a security passcode on it because you're selfish?
No, not at all.
Not at all. You put a passcode on it because you're responsible, right? And
Mm.
you intuitively know with your finances that you cannot give all people access because you don't know if all people will be responsible enough to do with your finances what needs to be done so you can be a good financial steward of your finances, right? So that you don't get bankrupted. So you only give maybe a very trusted person in your life access to your bank account, but you don't give everyone free access to your bank account. And again, it's not because you're unkind or rude or selfish. It's because you're limited and you don't want to go bankrupt. We know this with our bank accounts, but we forget this with all the other areas of capacity in our life. Just like we're limited in our financial capacity, we're limited in our relational capacity, we're limited in our physical capacity, we're limited in our emotional capacity. And so we tend to forget that in other areas. But we're already doing this really well with our finances. So we need to transfer that same understanding of bankruptcy because of a limited capacity with these words, access and responsibility, to the other areas of our life.
And what you're opening up in your new book is a conversation I think so many people will resonate with in different seasons of life through those ups and downs and the waves of relationships where at times they feel like really safe places and at other times they feel like dysfunction is just rife. In fact, one of the ways you described going into your book is that you've danced with dysfunction so many times in relationships. That dance is not one that we really want to be in, I don't think. And knowing when dysfunction is something we have to just accept and set aside. And as your book title says, knowing when to have these goodbye kind of moments. When is that time to actually leave a relationship? How do we determine that moment?
Well, it's going to be different for every person. And I always encourage people take steps, not leaps. We don't want to immediately just start ghosting our friend or divorcing our spouse or walking away from our parents, so we need to take steps, not leaps. And boundaries help us take appropriate steps to do everything we can to fight for the relationship. But ultimately, if someone we're in relationship with, if they're not just making a mistake, look, mistakes we all make, but instead, if those mistakes have turned into patterns, not just difficult patterns, but possibly destructive patterns, and they are only bringing zero responsibility, then we have to consider reducing their access down to their level of demonstrated responsibility. But here's our choice. Goodbyes don't always have to be hard and horrific, and they don't always have to be permanent. They could be for a season, or they may be for a lifetime. But the original expression of goodbye, it comes from the statement, God be with ye. That was the original version of goodbye. And then it was shortened to God BWY. And then it was shortened to goodbye. And so when I have to say hard goodbyes that break my heart, I fight with everything in me to save the relationship. And I've also gotten wise enough to acknowledge reality when the relationship has become unsafe or unsustainable. And even in that goodbye, though, I want to have a moment where the bitterness that comes at me doesn't get inside of me. And I'm able to take that person. I'm able to still appreciate the good moments that we had and place all of the hurt and heartbreak in, just mentally place it in the Lord's hands. And I start saying to that person, they may never hear it. I'm just saying it as a marked moment for myself. God be with ye. God be with ye. Goodbye. Goodbye. God be with ye. And I want a little more God be with ye in my goodbyes.
How do you keep that gentleness when the people that so often when having to say goodbye to, it's because for some reason they've hurt us, there's damage that's been done? How do you keep a tenderness toward them? And I think that hopeful perspective.
Well, I don't always keep that tenderness. It's easy to have tenderness on our conversation today, but in the emotional intensity of extreme heartbreak and hurt and betrayal, which I went through in my most significant relationship. And, when I experienced the death of my 30-year marriage, it wasn't something that I saw coming, and it was definitely not something that I wanted. And yet, biblically speaking, it was necessary. And it hurt so much. And I cried a million tears. But I also started to recognize when that grief comes to me, I need to have little mini funerals. And I think that's what's so hard. When someone passes away, we know what to do. We have a marked moment of a funeral, and people bring us casseroles, right?
Yeah.
But when we go through the grief of not someone passing away, but someone walking away, I've just discovered it's necessary to have a million little funerals. And when that sadness comes, and it comes a lot at first and then not as much over time, but when it comes, I've learned to pause, acknowledge it, not try to numb it out and not try to deny it. But I've got to learn to walk through and work through what I'm going through. And so I have a mini little funeral, and I teach people in the book, it's in the chapter, A Million Little Funerals. I teach people what to do to have a marked moment of recognizing the sadness, acknowledging the sadness, but not to get swallowed up by it.
And it's such wise advice, I think, because so many people will say that time heals and that we should just trust the passing of time to help us get through the healing that we need. But surely it's about how we use that time, having these, little funerals as we go along, that's going to make that time passing more effective.
That's right. And I think we always have to remember, especially in relationship hardship, that if we know we've given it everything we've got, and at the same time, acknowledge reality that if it's unsafe, unsustainable, or even unreasonable to stay in that relationship, that even God has provisions in the Bible for his people to say goodbye. Actually, sometimes God even commands us have nothing to do with these people. And I think sometimes it feels like we've learned lessons from the Bible on everything, but I had never learned these lessons. I'd never learned these important scriptures. I'd never learned about God's provision to say goodbye. And so I very intentionally in the book, Good Boundaries and Goodbyes, I take verses that have been weaponized against people, and I help people understand the real theological truth behind that Bible verse and a script that you can use if people try to weaponize that verse about a boundary or a goodbye in your life. One of those is, I often hear people say, yeah, but doesn't Jesus call us to lay down our life for our friends? And isn't that what he modeled? Yes, Jesus laid down his life for a high and holy purpose. He did not lay down his life to enable bad behavior to continue.
Oh, I'm so glad you brought that up, because I wanted to ask you about this, because I think as Christians, one of the flaws we can have is that we do take these scriptures and they can put us in situations where, as the subtitle of your book says, I want to say this: loving others without losing the best of yourself. We're setting good boundaries and goodbyes, loving others without losing the best of who you are. That is why we're putting these boundaries into place, so that we don't lose part of ourselves. And Christians can so easily do that when we look at scripture through this lens of sacrifice and through this lens of service, but it's actually really detrimental to our own well-being.
That's right. And we cannot control another person, but we are called to demonstrate a fruit of the Spirit called self-control. And self-control enables us to recognize what is acceptable and what is not acceptable, what is permitted and what is not permitted, in order for me to keep the best of who I am front and center. I don't want to become a fractured, frazzled person because I permit things to hyperextend my capacity over and over and over, to the point where I'm no longer kind. I'm no longer generous. I'm no longer patient, because things have pushed me, or people have pushed me, or unrealistic requests have pushed me past my limited capacity. And I'm not limited because I'm selfish. I'm limited because I'm human.
How do you think we distinguish between when we are setting a boundary in a healthy way through a biblical perspective, or if we're using boundaries to actually isolate ourselves and not sort of stretch ourselves in the way that we do care for the people around us?
That's a great question. And again, I think for all of us, we're just going to have to be really self-aware and honest with ourselves, because we don't want to use a boundary to skirt any kind of responsibility. For example, the holidays are coming up. So, a misuse of a boundary, or even a kind of a ridiculous boundary, would be to walk into the Thanksgiving family meal and to just simply announce, hey, everyone, I've drawn a boundary, so I am not helping wash any of the dishes this year. I just want you to know that. And, that's an example of you dismissing something you should be sensitive and kind about and be willing to help, right? And so a better example of a holiday boundary, it's not to push people away or to excuse yourself from responsibilities that you should do. But a better example would be, maybe there are some topics that you do not have the emotional capacity to dive into potential relationship turmoil that these polarizing conversations could happen. So an example of a healthy boundary would be to simply communicate to the person who typically brings up these controversial things at the dinner table. You could say, I love your curiosity about the world, Uncle Joe. And I love how you love to process those things with your family. I think it comes from a good place. Now, I have to share with you that I don't have the emotional capacity this year to dive into polarizing conversations, especially not around a holiday table. So it's totally your choice if you're going to bring these subjects up. I just want to let you know in advance that I will need to walk away, not because I'm disinterested in you, but because I don't have the emotional capacity for that topic. So see, you're not trying to control him. You're not trying to manipulate him. He still has a free choice, but you are expressing if this, then this. And you are remaining self-controlled by exiting that conversation and communicating that with a healthy boundary in advance will increase the chances of you actually walking away and actually holding yourself together. Boundaries aren't supposed to shove other people away, but they are for the purpose of holding yourself together.
And while something like doing that will take practice, I think also if we are able to get to a point where we can have these conversations in advance, set these boundaries in place, I feel like the benefit of that would be that you're not reacting in the moment when you're stressed and frazzled and you just don't want to have this conversation saying, can we just end this now, and walking away. You can come at it with a bit of a breath, a bit of gentleness and grace that maybe you wouldn't have if suddenly they dived into something like that around the dinner table, you know?
That's right. And instead of getting angry or mad or getting pulled into the emotion, we realize we don't have to attend every drama we're invited to. We just don't. And it is okay to excuse ourselves away from something that could hyperextend us or something that could make us angry or have a poor reaction we regret later, for sure.
And one of the big challenges I see in our ability to set boundaries and do this well is that as much as we are made in the image of God, and for the Christian, we want relationship with God, we're also humans who love to form relationship with people, who love to be needed, and who love to be that person that someone wants to have these difficult conversations with at times because we want to support them through it. But I think that can also show sometimes where we're trying to get from people what we should be getting from God. We're trying to seek validation from them instead of getting it from Him. When you start to see those nuances of our humanity maybe creeping in, what's your advice to people to seek from God instead the things we need as opposed to from people?
I think we have to get honest with ourselves about why we have some of these people pleasing tendencies. And so here comes confession time. Is it okay if I make a confession?
Please do.
So when I find myself slipping into unhealthy people pleasing, I have to admit that it's not always just to keep someone else happy. Sometimes I people please or try to make other people happy because I fear if I don't, they will take something from me that they're giving to me, that I'm worried if they take that away, I will not be okay. And so whether that's acceptance or whether that's opportunity or whether that is helping me not feel so alone, whatever that is, we have to be honest that we will always desperately want from other people what we fear we will never get from God. If we are walking in the understanding that we are already fully accepted and we are already fully loved, then we can walk into situations with less fear and more understanding that if by drawing a healthy boundary, I fear this person may reject me, then this person may reject me whether I draw this boundary or not. Because if they have the propensity to walk away, they have the propensity to walk away. My choice is to draw a healthy boundary. And that's probably the only fighting chance to keep that relationship intact, honestly.
Do you think that we can have an unhealthy desire for reconciliation? Because for people who have followed your story, for people who have read your previous books, especially the last one, Forgiving What You Can't Forget, we know that you have gone through this journey of forgiving, of trying to reconcile, now letting go of your marriage relationship. And obviously there's complexity to that. But there is also this desire that I recognize in you and also in many of our listeners to want reconciliation so badly because we know it is the ideal outcome. Can we sometimes have an unhealthy want for that that really makes us stay in difficult situations too long?
Yes, because again, we somehow, I won't say we, I'll speak for myself. I thought if I give enough, if I pray enough, if I sacrifice enough, if I overlook enough, if I extend the opportunity to overlook things enough, then somehow that would fix this other person. And what I realized is I can be a friend, I can be a wife, I can be a neighbor, I can be a sister, I can be a daughter. I cannot be a savior. And at some point, if a relationship has shifted from not just being difficult to being emotionally destructive, then it's not us walking away, it's us accepting reality. And I think for me, the hardest part was accepting reality, that this had become an unsustainable relationship. Did I cry? A million tears, yes. Did I then have to face the consequences of being lonely? 1,000% yes. Did it change my family in ways I never wanted it change? It absolutely did. But it wasn't biblically, emotionally, or even physically sustainable to stay in that relationship. And I had to acknowledge reality and accept reality, because where we accept reality, that's where the real grieving can begin. And the grieving has to begin so that we can learn to work through what we walk through.
It's huge. And I know we're not going to be able to talk about it in all of the ways that people would want to in such a short amount of time, Lysa. So in the last couple of moments that we do have together, I think I want to ask you, for the person who's listening right now, in the difficulty of whatever relationship tension they may be experiencing, knowing whether to stay, knowing when to go, and faith is in there as well. I think a big thing people wonder is, how do I continue to trust God? What is the place of my faith in these times where there is so many different dynamics at play? I don't know what scripture to declare over this. I don't know if God's going to work this out in the way I want. How do we trust God and accept reality while also remaining faithful?
Well, we will suffer a lot less the quicker that we recognize that we can trust God, and we stop resisting what's in front of us and denying what's in front of us, and instead just take what's in front of us and place it in the hands of God. And sometimes my prayers were reduced down to, God, you love me and I love you, and that's all I know right now. And I'm hurting. I don't like this. I don't want this. I'm begging you with everything in me to take this away. But at the end of the day, what other choice do I have but to trust you? Because you're the only fighting chance that some purpose can come from this pain. And, there's some words of Jesus in Matthew chapter 14, or Mark chapter 14, starting in verse 32, but really verse 34. It just strikes me how much Jesus understands the grit and grime of humanity. Jesus was sinless, but he was very much sinned against. And in Mark 14, verse 34, Jesus says, my soul is overwhelmed with sorrow to the point of death. He then goes on to say to God, Father, everything is possible for you. So take this cup from me. In other words, this hurts so bad, I think it might kill me. And God, everything's possible for you, so change the plan. But then Jesus utters 9 earth-shaking, hell-shattering, demon-quaking words, yet not what I will, but what you will. And so some days trusting God simply looks like, God, I don't like this, I don't want this, but I'm trading my will for thy will, because I'm so confident you will. You will do something that delivers me from this. And it may not be in my timing, and the outcome may not be what I want, but I'm trusting that somehow you will lead me through this and get me on the other side of this. And so I just want to speak tenderly to that person's heart who's just hanging on by a thread, just an absolute thread. I understand. I really, really understand. And that's a big reason why I wrote this book, Good Boundaries and Goodbyes, because this is the exact book I wish I would have had 2 years ago.
Yeah. Well, thank you for writing it. Thank you for your vulnerability. And thank you for just being so open about what you have walked through in the last few years, because I know it's going to resonate with so many people. So, Lysa, thank you so much for your time today and for writing your book. I really appreciate it.
Thank you. It's an honor to be with you. And we'll just say to be continued.
Absolutely. Lysa, thank you. Enjoy the rest of your day.
Thank you. You too. Bye-bye.
Bye.